Hallo, zoals beloofd hebben we over de belichtingsdriehoek. En de belichtingsdriehoek, dat betekent ook dat we het gaan hebben over het diafragma. Wat doet diafragma en hoe steekt het eigenlijk precies in elkaar? Diafragma zegt ook iets over scherptediepte. En in het begin, moet ik eerlijk zeggen, heb ik er zelf ook mee zitten worstelen. Ik denk, wat is dat nou eigenlijk? Hoe werkt dat nou? Ik heb een mooi filmpje gevonden. En dat is van...
Ik had het opgeschreven, maar nou weet ik niet. Volgens mij heet hij Brian, maar...
We zullen het zien. Kijk even rustig. Zo nodig speel het nog een keer af. Want dit is echt wel essentieel over scherptediepte. En in relatie tot de diafragma. Rustig kijken en veel plezier.
When it comes to understanding the technical side of photography, there's one area which causes more confusion than any other, and that's depth of field. It is, however, quite easy, so rather than feeling snookered, see what I did there? I'm going to show you in layman's terms just how easy it is. If you saw April's edition of Photography Online, Harry explained all about something called the plane of focus, an invisible wall which moves further and closer from the camera as we turn the focus ring on the lens. Only subjects which are positioned exactly on this plane of focus are ever truly sharp. All objects closer or further away are always going to be out of focus, but to varying degrees, and this is where depth of field comes in. Many photographers assume that by changing the aperture, we change the amount of our scene that's in focus, but this isn't actually true. Anything behind where we're focused or in front of where we're focused is always going to be out of focus regardless of which aperture we use. So let me demonstrate with some coloured balls. So if I focus on the pink ball here, you can see that the red ball, which is behind the plane of focus, is clearly not sharp, and the blue ball, which is in front of the plane of focus, is also not sharp. Only the pink ball or anything on that plane of focus is sharp. So if I place a yellow ball at the same distance from the camera as the pink ball, it's impossible to get one in focus and one out of focus. If you focus on one, the other one will automatically be sharp. Now let's look at what happens when we change the aperture. This diagram shows our snooker ball setup. We are looking side on to the camera and we are using a large aperture, as can be seen by the big opening in the lens which is letting lots of light through. Here's our pink ball, which is appearing on the sensor as finely focused points of light, as it is lying on our plane of focus. The blue ball, which is in front of the plane of focus, is being brought to a finely focused image behind our sensor, which means that when it hits our sensor, instead of each point of light appearing sharp, they appear as fuzzy areas known as circles of confusion. The red ball, which is behind our plane of focus, is being brought to a finely focused image in front of the sensor, which means by the time the points of light have reached the sensor, they have crossed over and are now also appearing as circles of confusion. The further away from our plane of focus a subject is, the larger the circles of confusion will be. As we focus, the lens moves closer and further away from the sensor, bringing different distances into focus. But let's stick with our setup here where I'm focused on the pink ball. Now I'm not going to move any balls and I'm not going to move the camera. All I'm going to do is reduce the aperture down to a tiny value. What this is going to do is it's going to make the circles of confusion so small that it's difficult to distinguish between circles of confusion and finely focused points of light. However, if we enlarge the image enough, we'll see that things that originally appeared in focus are actually still out of focus. So let's go back to our diagram and see what happens when we close the aperture of the lens. You can see that the pink ball is still being finely focused onto the sensor. The blue ball is still being focused behind the sensor, but the lines are crossing at a much shallower angle, meaning that when they hit the camera's sensor, they appear as smaller circles of confusion than they did when using a larger aperture. The same happens with the red ball, which is still being brought to a finely focused image in front of the sensor, but the smaller aperture is now causing the points of light to cross over at a shallower angle, meaning that the circles of confusion on the sensor are smaller. So in contrast to what many photographers believe, changing the aperture doesn't actually mean more of our scene is in focus. It just means that anything behind or in front of the plane of focus is less out of focus at smaller apertures than it is at bigger apertures. So it could be argued that there is no such thing as depth of field, as a lens can only focus on a single plane at any time. However, we need to imagine depth of field does exist in order to control how our scene is rendered. So in your mind, imagine that depth of field is the thickness of your plane of focus, and as you change the aperture of your lens, this invisible wall gets thicker and thinner. Got that? Good, because now we're going to look at the other influences of depth of field. There are 3 in total. The first one we've already looked at is aperture, the next one is focal length, and the last one is our distance to the plane of focus. When it comes to focal length, the longer the lens, the shallower the depth of field will be at any given aperture. So here I have 3 lenses. I have a 50mm, I have a 24mm, which is exactly half the focal length, and then I have a 100mm, which is exactly double the focal length. So we're going to start by looking at the difference between the 50mm and the 100mm. So first of all, I'm going to take the shot with a 50mm lens at f8. Now the balls aren't going to move and the camera's not going to move. I've got the white ball here to make sure that the camera, when I change lenses, the camera's position is exactly the same. Both of these images are taken at f8, and the distance to the pink ball, our plane of focus, remains the same. The only thing which has changed is the focal length, which is why the balls in the 100mm version appear twice the size, because we've doubled the focal length, or zoomed in twice as much. As you can see, the blue and the red ball appear more out of focus in the 100mm version. So now I'm going to take the same shot again, this time at 24mm, still at f8. And the camera hasn't moved because I'm going to back it up onto the cue ball here. The blue and the red ball appear to be more in focus, but this is only because the circles of confusion are smaller on a wide-angle lens than they are on a telephoto. When it comes to our distance to plane of focus, the closer we are to our subject, the shallower our depth of field, and the further away we are from our subject, the deeper our depth of field. So I'm going to take the same shots again, this time with a 50mm lens, and I'm going to use f4, and I'm going to take 2 shots, one close up, which is there, so I'm still focused on the pink ball, and now I'm going to take the same shot again from back here, still focusing on the pink ball, same aperture, same lens, nothing's changed in that regard. Look at these 2 examples, both taken at f4 with a 50mm lens. The one where I was close up to the pink ball has rendered the red and the blue ball far more out of focus than the shot where I was further away. Oh my God, I need a rest. Oh, thank you. Okay, so now we know the 3 influences of depth of field, here's how they affect the image we see. If we double the aperture value, say from f4 to f8 or from f11 to f22, we double the depth of field. If we double the focal length, i.e. from 50mm to 100mm, we effectively halve the depth of field twice. If we double the distance to our plane of focus, say from 2 meters to 4 meters, we effectively double the depth of field twice. So for those of you who are still following me, you may have noticed that those bottom 2 actually cancel each other out. Let me show you. If I use a 50mm lens and focus on the pink ball from around 1 meter away and use an aperture of f5.6, the shot looks like this. If I now want to increase my depth of field to render the blue and red balls more in focus, I can move back and double the distance of the pink ball to 2 meters, which will now in effect double my depth of field twice. I now take the shot and it looks like this. As you can see, the blue and red balls are less out of focus than they were when I was only 1 meter away. However, the balls have become too small for my liking, as they are now half their original size because I doubled my distance from them. To get them back to their original size, there's only one thing I can do without moving closer to them, and that's to zoom in by using a longer focal length. If I double the focal length, the size of the balls will also double, getting them back to where they were. But by doubling the focal length, I effectively halved the depth of field twice, undoing what I had gained by moving further away. So I'm back where I started and haven't actually changed the depth of field at all. So we only tend to use aperture to control depth of field because it has no counter effect, unlike the other two influences which will always cancel each other out. It is, however, important to understand that our distance to our subject and our focal length also affect depth of field. If we understand this, then we'll realise why, if using a long lens and focused at something quite close, we're never going to be able to get a deep depth of field. Or on the other end of the scale, if we use a very wide angle lens and we're focused a long way into the distance, we can never get a shallow depth of field. Both of these scenarios are impossible because two of the three influences of depth of field are working against you. A small aperture won't always give you a deep depth of field, and a large aperture won't always give you a shallow depth of field if the two other influences, focal length and distance to plane of focus, are working against you. If you want a really shallow depth of field, then choose a long lens, a wide aperture, and try and get as close to your subject as you possibly can. You now have all three influences all pulling in the same direction, all leaning towards that shallow depth of field. If you want everything in focus, then choose a wide angle lens, a small aperture, and try and come as far back from your subject as you possibly can. All three things are now leaning towards maximising your depth of field. Now, before I leave you with brain overload, if you have one of those apps or charts which tells you all about depth of field and where to focus, throw them away because they're of no use whatsoever. Here's why. The most important question to answer when it comes to deciding what is sufficient depth of field is how big is your image going to be and how close are you going to be viewing it from. Take a look at this photo. It looks like there's sufficient depth of field to render all the snooker balls sharply. So the depth of field is sufficient for the scene if this image is only ever going to be viewed as a thumbnail. However, if we enlarge the same image, say it's going to be used as an advertising billboard at a train station, then it's going to be printed at a large magnification, and importantly, people are going to be able to view it at close distances. We now need a totally different depth of field to render all the balls sharp. I can do this because I've asked myself those two important questions. A, how big is my image going to be? And B, how close is it going to be viewed from? No app or chart is ever going to ask you those questions, which is why they're next to useless. So hopefully I've given you enough information now to work out depth of field for yourself.
De volgende keer gaan we het hebben over de sluitertijd. Maar eerst moeten jullie dit weten. Je ziet ook dat ik hier nou op live view zit. Ik ga even van live view af. En je ziet ook dat ik nou op ISO 160 zit. Ik zet hem even op 100. Hij staat nou op ISO 100. Je ziet ook dat ik nou 1, 2, 3. Dus een verdubbeling. 1, 2, 3. 400, zie je dat? 1, 2, 3. Dan denk je van, waarom doen ze dat nou zo? Dan kun je fijner afstellen. Je kan ook met de sluitertijd gaan pielen. 3. 1, 2, 3. Als ik nou zeg maar op live view ga kijken. Dan zie je ook dat hij veel te donker is. De camera die maakt het wel weer wat beter, maar dat is niet de bedoeling. Even kijken, dan ga ik met de diafragma pielen. Kijk, dan zit ik 1 stap te hoog. 1, 2, 3. Dan zit ik weer op 0. Je kan ook 1 stap, 1 of 1 klik. Een derde stop, zeg maar. Dus een derde stop. Zo werkt het eigenlijk. Dus 1, 2, 3. 1 derde, 2 derde. Een volle stop.